The Concrete Furnace. The General's Vendetta Part 1. The illusion of the Soviet utopia. The year was 1981. The Soviet Union was drifting into an era that historians would later label as the Great Stagnation, but for those living inside it, it felt like an eternity, a stable, gray, and immovable reality. Every evening, the flickering television screens of the Republic broadcasted the program Vremya, reporting on record-breaking milk yields and the heroic battle for the harvest. In the cinemas, the gentle, melancholic comedies of Eldar Ryazanov played to packed houses, offering a warm refuge from the cold lines for Finnish boots or rare sausages. The citizens of the USSR lived under a carefully curated myth that in a socialist paradise, organized crime did not exist. There were no serial killers, no monsters in human skin. Those were the beastly grimaces of a decaying capitalist West. We were told that the Soviet person was a creator, a builder of the future, and that any murderer was merely a freak of nature, a biological error that the valiant militia would identify and eliminate within 48 hours. But there was another truth, a truth whispered only in the cramped kitchens of Khrushchev-era apartments, with the windows tightly shut and the radio turned up to mask the conversation. This was the truth of the forest belts, the abandoned construction sites, and the dead-end alleys. It was a truth hidden in folders marked top secret, or even worse, in folders stamped with refused. Lack of evidence. Today, we tell the story of a nightmare that the system tried to bury. It is a story of how the very apparatus designed to protect the people chose to close its eyes to a monster for the sake of a clean report. It is the story of how the indifference of men in uniform gave birth to a beast, and what happens when that beast makes the fatal mistake of choosing the wrong victim. This is not a tale of a courtroom and a legal trial. This is a story of a primal, brutal, and perhaps the only possible form of justice in an era where the law had become a hollow facade. Before we descend into the shadows of the 80s, I ask you to do one thing. Hit the subscribe button and like this video. This isn't just about supporting the channel, it's a signal that these stories, the stories of the real price of justice, must be told. Done? Thank you. Then we begin. Imagine the city of N, a typical provincial center in the heart of the Russian heartland. It was a landscape of smoking factory chimneys and vast micro-districts of gray panel buildings, surrounded by dense, primeval forests. The autumn of 1981 arrived early and wet. The sun vanished by 4 p.m., and the streetlights, as was customary, worked only intermittently. In the courtyards of the sleeping districts, the darkness was absolute. It was in this darkness that people began to vanish. At first, there were only rumors, sticky, cold, and persistent like the autumn fog. A woman didn't return from the evening shift, a girl went to music school and never came home. But the city continued its rhythmic, indifferent life. There is a strange quality to the human psyche. The belief that it won't happen to me. Or worse, the cynical assumption. She probably just ran off with a lover. Youth is a wild thing. Unfortunately, this was exactly the mentality of the men sitting in the regional militia headquarters. Captain Sorokin, the head of the local criminal investigation department, was a man exhausted by the weight of his own cynicism. At 45, he dreamed only of his pension, his dacha, and the hope that his superiors would leave him alone. In the Soviet militia of that era, there existed a terrifying phenomenon known as the stick system, Palaknaya Sistema. It was a tyranny of statistics. The most important thing was a beautiful number in the quarterly report to present to the party leadership. An unsolved murder, a hanging case, was a stain on a career. It meant lost bonuses, denied promotions, and official reprimands. Why ruin the statistics of socialist competition with a missing person report when you could simply claim the girl had probably just run away to Moscow to become an actress? Can you imagine the despair of a mother standing before the duty officer's window? A simple Soviet woman, perhaps a teacher or a factory weaver, her hands shaking as she grips a damp handkerchief. "Comrade officer, my daughter is not home. She is 17, an honor student. She is never late." And what did she hear in response? The officer, without looking up from his crossword or his glass of tea, would drawl, "Sightiseness, don't spread panic. 17 is a flighty age. Spring in the head, even if it's autumn outside. She'll turn up after a few days with some boyfriend." We only take reports after 3 days. Go home and stop bothering us." And she would go. She would walk out into the freezing night to search the empty parks alone, calling out a name into the void. Meanwhile, the precious golden hours of the investigation, when a trail is still warm, were washed away by the rain of systemic indifference. In Captain Sorokin's office, the air was thick with cigarette smoke. His operatives discussed football and traded jokes. In the desk drawer, hidden away, lay reports about the disappearance of 14-year-old Lena, 19-year-old Ira, and 24-year-old Svetlana. "Sorokin, that mother of Lena's was here again," a young lieutenant would say. "She says there's a maniac in the city." "Bite your tongue," Sorokin would snap. "There are no maniacs in the Soviet Union. That's a capitalist disease. They'll come back when they're hungry. Don't file it yet. If we file a murder and she comes home next week, we'll have a hanging case on our books till the end of the quarter. Do you want to lose your bonus?" I don't. The bonus was more important than a life. The statistics were more important than the tears. The system protected itself, and the beast, the gray, invisible monster walking among them, knew it. He felt the indifference. He felt the impunity. He was a shadow in a city that refused to look at its own darkness. Part 2. The Predator's omnipotence and the General's shadow. The Predator, who haunted the gray streets of city and was not a monster from a storybook, he was a master of the mundane. In the Soviet Union, the most dangerous people were often the most invisible, the ones who blended into the morning commute, the ones who stood in the same lines for milk, the ones who nodded politely to the elderly women sitting on the benches outside their apartment blocks. We shall call him Viktor. Viktor was 32 years old, a man of average height with a face so unremarkable it seemed to slide out of a person's memory the moment they looked away. He worked as a driver for the local municipal bakery, piloting a battered, cream-colored Gaz 53 truck with bread painted in faded blue letters on its side. It was the perfect camouflage. A bread truck is welcomed everywhere. It can park in any courtyard at any hour, and no one, not the nosy neighbors, not the bored street sweepers, and certainly not the idle militia patrols, would ever think to question its presence. Inside the cab, it smelled of warm yeast and cheap diesel. In the back, among the empty wooden trays, was where the darkness lived. Viktor was a model worker. His photograph sat on the board of honor at the motor depot. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and he was a quiet, unassuming father to 2 small children. His wife, Vera, a seamstress at a local atelier, believed she had married a stable, if somewhat distant man. She didn't know that when Viktor worked the late shifts, he wasn't just delivering batons of white bread to the 24-hour kiosks. He was hunting. For over a year, Viktor had operated in a vacuum created by the state's own denial. He watched the evening news, he listened to the official proclamations of Soviet safety, and he smiled. He knew the militia were not looking for a serial killer because, officially, serial killers were a Western decadent myth. He saw the mothers of his victims crying on the steps of the police stations, and he saw the officers shooing them away like stray dogs. This gave him a sense of absolute, intoxicating omnipotence. He began to view himself not as a criminal, but as a god of the gray city. He decided who would vanish and who would stay. He felt as though he were wearing an invisible cloak woven from the very red tape that bound Captain Sorokin's hands. But impunity is a dangerous narcotic. It breeds boredom, and boredom leads to recklessness. Viktor grew tired of the easy prey, the lonely students, or the tired factory girls. He wanted a challenge. He wanted to reach into the world of the highborn, the nomenklatura, the elite who lived behind the heavy oak doors of the improved planning apartment blocks. He wanted to prove that even their ivory towers were not safe from the bread truck driver. The evening of October 15, 1983, was draped in a cold, drizzling shroud. Elena Rokotova was walking home from the Regional Drama Theater. She was 35 years old, a woman of striking elegance, dressed in a tailored wool coat with a collar of dark mink. She was a woman who moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never known fear. And why should she? She was the wife of General Lieutenant Pavel Rokotov, a titan of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. Pavel Rokotov was a man made of scorched earth and tempered steel. He had spent the last decade in the shadows of the world's most dangerous conflicts. When the Soviet Union moved into Afghanistan, Rokotov was there. When special operations were required in the scorching deserts of Africa or the jungles of Southeast Asia, Rokotov was the one who drew the plans. He was a man who lived in a world where impossible was simply a problem to be solved with enough pressure and enough blood. He had recently returned from a secret mission, his chest heavy with medals that he could never wear in public, his soul weary from a war that didn't exist on the maps. Elena had dismissed her official driver a few blocks early. She wanted to breathe the damp autumn air, to enjoy the solitude of the quiet, elite district where the regional party leaders lived. She believed the city was her garden. She didn't hear the gas, 53 truck idling in the shadows of an archway. She didn't notice the man in the gray quilted jacket stepping out from behind a dumpster. Viktor didn't know who she was. He didn't see the wife of a general, he saw a trophy. He saw the expensive fur, the smell of French perfume, and the arrogance of her stride. He wanted to break that arrogance. He attacked with the clinical efficiency he had honed over a dozen kills. A heavy blow to the temple with a wrapped lead pipe. Silence. Darkness. He dragged her into the pitch-black maw of a courtyard that the streetlights had forgotten. There, amidst the smell of damp brick and rotting leaves, he committed his final and most horrific crime. He was not just a killer, he was a desecrator. He left his signature. A specific, ritualistic mutilation that the local militia had ignored in 10 previous cases, dismissing them as isolated incidents of hooliganism. When he was finished, Viktor wiped his blade on her mink coat, spat on the broken body of the woman who had represented everything he envied, and melted back into the night. He drove home, washed his hands with laundry soap, and sat down to a late dinner of cabbage soup with his wife. He believed this was just another hanging case for the lazy Captain Sorokin. He believed the city would whisper for a day and then forget, just as it always did. He didn't know that by killing Elena Rokotova, he had not just broken a law. He had declared war on a man who didn't understand the concept of a cold case. He had awakened a force that didn't care about quarterly reports or socialist competition statistics. The next morning, the city of N would wake up to a different world. The gray stagnation was about to be burned away by the white-hot fury of a man who had spent his life hunting the enemies of the state, and who was now turning his sights on the monster in his own backyard. Part 3. The awakening of the Steel Titan. The morning of October 16, 1983, broke with a sky the color of a bruised lung. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a world that glistened with a cold, oily sheen. In the courtyard of the elite district, 2 street sweepers, elderly men in tattered quilted jackets, were busy clearing the sodden leaves from the gutters. It was a mundane, rhythmic task, the scratch of their birch twig brooms the only sound in the early morning stillness. Then, behind the rusted dumpsters of the old archway, they saw it. At first, they thought it was a discarded store mannequin, perhaps thrown away after a display. But mannequins do not bleed, and mannequins do not wear mink coats that cost more than a street sweeper earns in 5 years. When they saw the pale, elegant hand outstretched on the gray concrete, its gold wedding band catching a sliver of the weak morning light, the older man dropped his broom. He didn't scream, he simply backed away, his breath hitching in his chest, crossing himself with a trembling hand, a gesture forbidden by the party but remembered by the heart. By 8 a.m., the courtyard was a hive of half-hearted activity. Captain Sorokin had arrived in his battered used bobik, yawning and nursing a headache from the previous night's vodka. He stood over the body, his breath pluming in the cold air, a lit Prima cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. "What do we have, Petrov?" Sorokin asked, not looking at his sergeant. "A female, early 30s, looks like. Expensive clothes. Jewelry is gone. Robbery, comrade captain. Probably some addicts or drunks from the neighboring district." Sorokin nodded, his mind already formulating the report. Robbery with fatal outcome. File it under armed banditry. Check the local dens, shake down the usual suspects. And for heaven's sake, keep the photographers away. We don't need the neighborhood gossiping about Lady Fur being found in a dump. Sorokin was comfortable. He was in his element. He was about to bury Elena Rokotova in a pile of paperwork, just as he had buried all the others. He didn't know that the clock on his career, and perhaps his life, had just reached 0. The sound of the approaching cars was the first sign that the world had changed. It wasn't the rattling hum of a militia use or the familiar chug of a gas. 24 taxi. It was the deep, authoritative roar of high-performance engines. 3 black Chaika limousines and 2 Volga sedans with darkened windows screeched into the narrow courtyard, moving with a synchronized, aggressive precision that sent the loitering militiamen scurrying for cover. Men in civilian overcoats, with the unmistakable, ramrod-straight posture of the elite special forces, erupted from the vehicles. They didn't show IDs, they simply pushed the local militia aside with a silent, terrifying force. Then, the rear door of the lead Chaika opened. Pavel Rokotov stepped out. He was not wearing his uniform, but the aura he projected was more powerful than any set of shoulder boards. His hair was iron gray, his face a landscape of scars and weathered lines, but it was his eyes that froze the blood in Sorokin's veins. They were the eyes of a man who had watched civilizations burn and had never blinked. They were eyes that contained no hope, only a cold, focused intent. Rokotov walked toward the body of his wife. The crowd of militiamen parted for him like the Red Sea. Sorokin tried to speak. "Citizen, you can't be here. This is a crime scene." But a young man in a trench coat, a GRU major with a face like a hatchet, placed a hand on Sorokin's chest. The pressure was slight, but it felt like being held by a hydraulic press. "Be quiet, Captain," the major whispered. "If you value your breath, do not make a sound." The general knelt beside Elena. He did not weep. He did not cry out. He reached out and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His hand was steady, a surgeon's hand, a killer's hand. He touched the marks on her neck, the signature Viktor had left. For a full minute, the courtyard was as silent as a tomb. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Rokotov stood up, and when he turned to face Sorokin, the captain felt as though he were standing in the path of a glacier. "Who is in charge here?" Rokotov asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried a resonance that made the windows in the nearby buildings rattle. I am, comrade." "General," Sorokin stammered, his cigarette falling into the mud. "Captain Sorokin, we are investigating a robbery." "We'll find them, I assure you." "Robbery?" Rokotov repeated the word as if it were a foul-tasting poison. He stepped closer until Sorokin could smell the faint scent of expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of something cold. "You see this mark on her throat, Captain? This specific pattern of bruising? How many times have you seen it this year?" Sorokin's tongue felt like a piece of dry leather. I don't know what you mean. We've had a few incidents." 10, Rokotov cut him off. 10 cases in the last 14 months. 6 deaths for disappearances, all with the same signature. And you, Captain, have filed every single one of them as accidents, drunken brawls, or voluntary departures. But the statistics, Comrade General. We had no proof of a serial. Rokotov didn't let him finish. He grabbed Sorokin by the collar of his uniform, lifting the 45-year-old man off the ground as if he were a sack of grain. "You didn't want a hanging case on your books, Sorokin," Rokotov hissed, his face inches from the captain's. "You traded my wife's life and the lives of those other women for a quarterly bonus. You allowed a beast to walk your streets because you were too lazy to do your job." Rokotov dropped him. Sorokin collapsed into the mud, gasping for air. "Major," Rokotov said, turning to his assistant. "Yes, Comrade General? Seal this city. I want every exit blocked. I want the regional archives seized. If a single page of the missing persons files is missing, I want the archivist shot. And bring me the head of the regional MVD. Tell him he has exactly 1 hour to report to me at the military sanatorium. If he is 1 minute late, he will be stripped of his rank and sent to a labor battalion." "And the militia, sir?" Rokotov looked down at Sorokin with a disgust so profound it was almost holy. "They are no longer part of this investigation. They are now suspects in a case of criminal negligence and treason against the citizens of the USSR. Take them all to the interrogation rooms. I want to know everything they've been hiding." As the black cars roared away, leaving the local police in the hands of the silent, grim-faced GRU men, the city of N felt a shift in the atmosphere. The stick system had collapsed. The gray peace of the stagnation was over. A war had come to the provincial streets, and the hunter was no longer a bread truck driver. The hunter was now a general who had forgotten how to forgive. Part 4. The Sanatorium of Shadows and the Geometry of Death. The Pine Grove Military Sanatorium, sat 5 kilometers outside the city limits, a sprawling complex of neoclassical stone and glass hidden behind a 3-meter-high concrete fence topped with electrified wire. Officially, it was a place of rest for high-ranking officers recovering from grueling assignments in the Far East or the scorching deserts of the South. In reality, it was a fortress equipped with secure communication lines that bypassed the civilian exchanges and a landing pad that could accommodate the heavy Mi-8 helicopters of the military elite. By noon on October 16th, the sanatorium had been transformed. The billiard room, once a sanctuary of quiet leisure and the clicking of ivory balls, was now a tactical command center. Long tables had been pushed together, covered with high-resolution military maps of City Inn. Dark, heavy curtains were drawn shut, and the room was lit by the cold, buzzing glow of portable industrial lamps. General Pavel Rokotov stood at the head of the room. He had not slept, nor had he eaten. His face was a mask of granite, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the maps as if they were battlefields in the Panjshir Valley. Around him were 10 of the GRU's finest analysts and operatives, men who specialized in finding needles in the haystacks of foreign capitals. Now, they were applying the same cold, lethal logic to the provincial sprawl of a Soviet industrial center. "Report," Rokotov commanded. Major Volkov, the hatchet-faced officer who had handled the militia in the courtyard, stepped forward. He held a thick stack of folders, their covers stained with the dust of the neglected regional archives. "Comrade General, we have recovered 42 files of missing persons and accidental deaths that were suppressed by Captain Sorokin's department over the last 3 years. We've also brought in the mothers and sisters who were turned away at the precinct. Their testimonies are illuminating." Volkov began pinning photographs to a large corkboard. One by one, the faces of the lost appeared. Lena, 14 IRA, 19 Svetlana, 24. These were no longer just names on a list, they were a collective indictment of a system that had traded their lives for a quarterly bonus. "The signature is consistent in 12 cases," Volkov continued, his voice as clinical as a surgeon's. "The ritualistic mutilation, the specific method of strangulation, and the fact that the victims were all taken during the late afternoon or early evening hours. But there is more. We've plotted the locations of the abductions and the recovery of the bodies." He gestured to the map. Red pins marked where women had vanished, black pins marked where they were found. "The local militia looked at this and saw chaos," Volkov said, a hint of disgust creeping into his tone. "They saw random crimes in a dark city. But look closer at the timing and the geography. These pins aren't random. They follow the arterial roads of the municipal logistics network." Rokotov leaned in, his gaze following the red lines Volkov had drawn between the pins. "Explain," the general barked. "Most of the victims disappeared near grocery stores, canteens, or school cafeterias. And the timing. The abductions occur exactly 60 to 90 minutes after the final daily deliveries are made. We're not looking for a drifter or a vagrant, sir. We're looking for someone who has a legitimate reason to be in every district, someone who is invisible precisely because he is expected." "A driver," Rokotov whispered. "Exactly. A driver for the municipal supply chain. A postal van, a laundry truck, or most likely, a food delivery vehicle. These vehicles have access to rear courtyards, arched passages, and restricted zones. They can park for 30 minutes without attracting a single glance from a patrol." The room grew even colder as the implication settled. The monster wasn't hiding in the shadows, he was hiding in plain sight, fueled by the very state that refused to admit he existed. "Major," Rokotov said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "I want the logs from every municipal transport depot in the city. I want the names of every driver who was on duty during these 12 dates. Cross-reference them with those who have a history of hooliganism or disciplinary issues that were hushed up. We're already on it, sir. We've seized the personnel files from the Bakery Combine and the Dairy Trust. But we have a problem. The local MVD leadership is resistant. They claim we are overstepping our jurisdiction." At that moment, the heavy oak doors of the billiard room swung open. A man in a high-ranking militia uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons of administrative service, marched in. This was General Kuznetsov, the regional head of the MVD. He was flushed, his face a mask of bureaucratic outrage. "Rokotov, Kuznetsov shouted. What is the meaning of this? You've detained my officers, you've seized state archives, and you've turned a sanatorium into a prison. This is a violation of every Soviet legal protocol. Eve already called Moscow. Rokotov didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. He simply looked at the photograph of Elena on the board. Major Volkov, Rokotov said quietly. Yes, Comrade General. Does General Kuznetsov have his service pistol on him? Volkov stepped forward and patted down the outraged MVD chief. He pulled a Makarov PM from a leather holster. He does, sir. Good, Rokotov said. He finally turned to face Kuznetsov. The MVD general flinched, the words of protest dying in his throat as he looked into Rokotov's eyes. General Kuznetsov, I don't care about your protocols. My wife is in a morgue because your subordinates are incompetent and corrupt. You can call Moscow, you can call the Politburo, you can call the ghost of Lenin for all I care. But until I find the man who did this city is under my command. Rokotov stepped closer, his presence filling the room with a terrifying weight. You have two choices, Kuznetsov. You can sit in the corner of this room and give my men every piece of information they ask for, or I can have you arrested for treason and complicity in the murders of 12 Soviet citizens. Because every day that beast was on the streets under your watch, you were the one holding the door open for him. Kuznetsov's face went from red to a sickly, translucent white. He looked at the maps, at the grim-faced GRU operatives, and at the Makarov pistol in Volkov's hand. He realized that the rules of the gray world had been suspended. He was no longer a powerful official, he was a witness in a war zone. I will cooperate, Kuznetsov stammered, sinking into a chair. Good, Rokotov said, turning back to the map. Major Volkov, continue. Tell me about the bread trucks. As the afternoon light faded into a bleak, wintry dusk, the geometry of death began to reveal its center. The GRU analysts were narrowing the list. From thousands of drivers, they were down to hundreds, then dozens. They were looking for a man who was average, a man who was quiet, a man who was perfect. And in a small, cramped apartment across town, Viktor sat at his kitchen table, eating a bowl of cold kasha, listening to the sirens in the distance. He felt a strange, new sensation prickling at the back of his neck. For the first time in his life, the bread truck driver felt that the darkness he had served for so long was no longer his friend. The hunter was closing the circle, and the stick system wasn't there to protect the beast anymore. Part 5. The radius of the predator and the unmasking the night inside the Pine Grove Sanatorium was not measured by hours, but by the growing pile of cigarette butts in the crystal ashtrays and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the analyst's typewriter. While the rest of the city slept in its gray, stagnant peace, the tactical command center was vibrating with a cold, predatory energy. Pavel Rokotov sat in the shadows of the room, his eyes never leaving the corkboard where the 12 victims stared back at him. He wasn't looking for sympathy, he was looking for a pattern. We have it, Comrade General, Major Volkov said, his voice cracking slightly from fatigue. He placed a single, thin folder on the table before Rokotov. It wasn't a shiny new file, it was an old, yellow document from the archives of a military construction battalion, the Stroybat, stationed 50 kilometers away in 1978. Viktor Sleptsov, Volkov began. 32 years old. Currently a driver for the 3rd Bakery Combine. His record at the motor depot is spotless, over-fulfillment of the plan, 0 accidents, excellent ideological standing. But we went deeper. We looked into his military service. Rokotov opened the folder. A black-and-white photograph of a young man with a flat, unremarkable face looked back. It was the face of a man who could vanish into a crowd of 3. In 1978, Volkov continued, Sleptsov was a private in the construction battalion. There was an incident. A local girl was found in a ravine near the barracks. She survived, but she was traumatized. She identified Sleptsov. But the unit commander, a colonel who didn't want to jeopardize his promotion to Moscow, suppressed the report. He claimed the girl was unstable and that Sleptsov was on guard duty at the time. Sleptsov was quietly demobilized 2 months early. The record was buried in the internal archives of the Ministry of Defense. Rokotov's fingers tightened on the edge of the folder until the cardboard groaned. So, the military bureaucracy protected him then, and the civil bureaucracy protected him now. He has spent his entire life being saved by men who were afraid of paperwork. There's more, sir, Volkov said, gesturing to the map. We've tracked his delivery route for the last 48 hours. On the evening of October 15th, Sleptsov's bread truck, Gaz 53, license plate 44 to 12 BNA, deviated from its scheduled path. He claimed a mechanical issue required him to take a detour through the elite district. He was in that courtyard for exactly 22 minutes. The same time Elena was taken. Rokotov stood up. The room seemed to shrink as he straightened his back. The air was suddenly charged with a lethal intent. Where is he now? He started his morning shift at 5 a.m. He is currently on the return leg of his route, heading toward the outskirts near the industrial zone. He is alone in the vehicle. Does he know we're watching? No, sir. We've used civilian-clothed scouts and dummy taxis. He thinks the city is just on high alert because of the robbery. He is calm. He even stopped to buy a newspaper 10 minutes ago. Rokotov walked to the window, looking out at the bleak, misty morning. We are not going to arrest him in the street. I don't want a scene. I don't want a crowd of curious onlookers, and I certainly don't want some local prosecutor arriving to talk about due process. If he senses a trap, he might crash the truck or use a weapon. I want him intact. What are your orders, Comrade General? The Object 12 military proving ground, Rokotov said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. It's 10 kilometers down the highway he's currently on. It's restricted, isolated, and under my direct jurisdiction. Set up a militia checkpoint 3 kilometers before the gates. Use our men, but have them wear standard MVD uniforms. Tell him it's a routine check for Operation Harvest. When he stops, I want him neutralized. Not killed. Neutralized. And the evidence, sir? If we don't find a direct link, the MVD leadership will try to reclaim him. Rokotov turned, a ghostly, terrifying smile touching his lips. We will find the link, Volkov. Men like Sleptsov cannot help but keep a part of their victims. It's their only way to feel they own the world. He will have a trophy. And when we find it, I want him brought to the bunker at Object 12. I want the room prepared. No cameras. No recorders. Just me and the model worker. At 7:15 a.m., Viktor Sleptsov was whistling a popular Soviet tune as he steered his bread truck down the damp highway. The cab smelled of warm rye and diesel fumes. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The lady in mink had been his greatest achievement. He felt stronger, faster, more alive. He looked at the gray, dreary commuters and the passing buses and felt a profound contempt. They were cattle, he was the wolf. He reached into the pocket of his quilted jacket and felt the small, rectangular slip of paper he had kept. It was a theater ticket from Elena's purse, the Cherry Orchard, row 4, seat 12. It was his souvenir, his proof that he had reached into the world of the gods and dragged one of them down into the mud. He saw the red and white barrier of a militia checkpoint a few hundred meters ahead. 2 officers in blue greatcoats were waving a striped baton. Viktor didn't feel a flicker of fear. He had been through a dozen checkpoints since the murder. He was a bread truck driver, he was the blood of the city. He slowed the truck, his brakes squealing in the cold air, and rolled down the window. Morning, Chief, Viktor said, flashing a practiced, humble smile. Bakery Combine number 3. Fresh batons for the industrial canteen. Operation Harvest, right? The officer, a man with cold, slate-gray eyes, didn't smile back. Step out of the vehicle, Citizen Sleptsov. Routine inspection. Viktor's smile faltered, just for a millisecond. Sleptsov? How do you know my name, Lieutenant? I haven't even shown you the waybill. Before he could react, the door of the cab was ripped open. A hand like a steel vise grabbed him by the throat and yanked him out. Viktor hit the wet asphalt hard. He tried to scramble up, his mind racing. How? Who? But a heavy boot pressed into the small of his back, pinning him to the ground. Search him, a voice commanded. Hands tore through his pockets. They found the theater ticket. They found the folding knife tucked into his belt. Viktor felt a cold, hollow sensation in his gut. The invisible cloak had been shredded. Citizen Sleptsov, the officer said, leaning down so that his face was inches from Viktor's. The man wasn't a militiaman, he was something else entirely. You are being detained for crimes against the state. You will not be going to the precinct. A black hood was shoved over Viktor's head, plunging him into a terrifying, lightless world. He felt himself being lifted and thrown into the back of a van. The engine roared, and the bread truck driver realized with a jolt of primal terror that the system hadn't just found him. The system had decided to stop being a system and start being a shadow. 10 kilometers away, in the subterranean depths of the Object 12 proving ground, General Pavel Rokotov stood in a room of cold concrete and steel. He adjusted his watch. The hunter and the beast were finally about to meet, and in the concrete furnace of the military bunker, the quarterly bonuses and the stick system were 1,000 miles away. Part 6. The heart of the labyrinth and the face of the void. Object 12 was a place that did not exist on any map available to the public. To the few locals who lived in the scattered villages nearby, it was merely the testing ground, a vast, forested area where the earth occasionally shook with the muffled thud of underground explosions and where the night sky sometimes glowed with the unnatural, pale violet of experimental chemical flares. It was a facility designed for the testing of structural integrity under extreme conditions. The heat of a jet engine's exhaust, the pressure of a simulated nuclear blast, and the corrosive effects of atmospheric reentry. It was a world of concrete, steel, and absolute silence. Deep beneath the frosted pine needles and the frozen soil, in the subterranean level 3, was the interrogation suite. It was not a room designed for legal proceedings. It was a bunker within a bunker, a chamber of raw, unpainted concrete walls that wept with condensation. There were no windows, no clocks, and no decorative portraits of the general secretary. There was only a single, bolted-down chair, a heavy iron table, and the persistent, low-frequency hum of a ventilation system that seemed to breathe with a mechanical, indifferent lung. Viktor Sleptsov was strapped into the chair. His wrists were cinched to the iron arms with thick, industrial-grade zip ties that bit into his skin with every movement. He was still wearing his quilted driver's jacket, but it was now stained with the grime of the asphalt where he had been tackled. The black hood was still over his head, hot and stifling with his own rapid, shallow breath. He could hear footsteps, not the frantic, hurried steps of a man in a rush, but the slow, deliberate tread of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere to go. Each footfall echoed against the concrete like a hammer on a tombstone. Suddenly, the hood was ripped away. The light was blinding. A high-intensity industrial lamp, shielded by a steel cage, was aimed directly at his face. Viktor winced, his eyes watering, his vision a blur of white and violet spots. As his pupils slowly adjusted, he saw a silhouette standing just outside the circle of light. General Pavel Rokotov did not look like the avenging angel Viktor might have imagined in his feverish nightmares. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by a fire and filled with liquid nitrogen. He was standing perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his gray hair silvered by the harsh light. On the iron table between them lay 2 items: Viktor's folding knife and the theater ticket for the cherry orchard. "Do you know where you are, Citizen Sleptsov?" Rokotov's voice was a low, dry rasp, like sandpaper on bone. Viktor tried to summon his mask, the model worker, the humble driver. He swallowed hard, his throat feeling like it was lined with glass. I don't understand, comrade officer. There's been a mistake. I'm a driver. Bakery combined number 3. I have a family. My wife, Vera, shall be worried. Vera is currently being questioned by the MGB, Rokotov interrupted, his voice devoid of any inflection. Your children have been taken to a state facility for temporary protective custody. Your apartment is being dismantled floorboard by floorboard. The mistake, Viktor, was yours. You assumed that the darkness would always be your friend. You assumed that because the local militia was lazy, the state was blind. Viktor's heart hammered against his ribs. The theater ticket on the table seemed to glow under the light. I found that, he stammered, his mind racing. The ticket. I found it in the street. I thought it was pretty. I'm a collector. You are a scavenger, Rokotov said, stepping into the light. The general's face was a map of cold fury. You didn't find this in the street. You took it from the purse of a woman you murdered in a dark courtyard. You took it because you wanted to own a piece of a world you could never belong to. You wanted to feel that you were a god because you could extinguish a life. Rokotov leaned down, placing his hands on the iron table. He was so close that Viktor could see the fine web of broken capillaries in the general's eyes. eyes that hadn't seen sleep in days. You didn't just kill a woman, Viktor. You killed Elena Rokotova. You killed my wife. And in doing so, you stepped out of the world of Article 102 and criminal codes. You stepped into my world. Viktor felt the floor fall away beneath him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just killed a wealthy nomenclatura lady. He had killed the wife of the man who ran the shadows. The invisible cloak he had worn for years hadn't just been shredded, it had been set on fire. I didn't know, Viktor whimpered, the godlike arrogance he had felt in the bakery truck evaporating into a thin, foul-smelling sweat. It was an accident. I was drunk. I didn't mean to. Do not lie to me, Rokotov hissed. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with his suppressed violence. I have seen the bodies. I have seen the marks on their throats. I have seen the way you used your knife. There is no accident in what you do. There is only a void. A beast that needs to be fed. Rokotov stood up and turned to a man standing in the corner of the room, a man in a white lab coat who held a clipboard. This was not a doctor of medicine, he was a specialist in environmental stress testing. Is the chamber ready? Rokotov asked. Yes, Comrade General, the specialist replied, his voice neutral. The concrete is cured. The induction heaters are at nominal levels. We can begin the cycle whenever you are ready. Viktor's eyes darted between the two men. Chamber? What chamber? I want a lawyer. I want to speak to the prosecutor. You can't do this. This is the Soviet Union. We have laws. Rokotov looked at him, and for a fleeting second, a look of genuine pity crossed the general's face. The pity one might feel for a rabid dog that doesn't understand why it's being put down. The Soviet Union is a dream, Viktor. A dream of order and progress. But dreams require people like me to stand in the dark and keep the nightmares away. You are a nightmare that became too loud. And the laws? The laws are for people. You are just a biological error that needs to be corrected. Rokotov leaned in one last time, his voice a ghost of a whisper. You loved to watch them suffer, didn't you? You loved the heat of their fear. You loved the way their breath hitched when they realized they were alone with you. Today, Viktor, we are going to conduct an experiment in thermodynamics. We are going to see how much heat a model worker can take before he turns back into the dust he came from. Rokotov signaled to the guards. They stepped forward and unbolted the chair from the floor, lifting Viktor, still strapped and screaming, as if he were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. They carried him down a long, echoing corridor toward a heavy, circular steel door. Above the door was a red light and a sign that read, Caution, thermal testing in progress. The bread truck driver, the god of the gray city, finally understood that the concrete furnace was not a metaphor. It was his new home. Part 7. The kinetic purgatory and the first degrees. The thermal testing chamber of Object 12 was a masterpiece of cold, scientific brutality. It was a concrete cube, 3 meters in every direction, lined with specialized ceramic tiles designed to withstand the hellish friction of a spacecraft's re-entry into the atmosphere. This was the laboratory for the Buran project, the Soviet response to the American space shuttle. Here, the state tested the limits of matter itself. The walls were embedded with high-frequency induction coils that could vibrate the molecular structure of the air, raising the temperature with a surgical, invisible precision. There were no flames, no smoke, only a dry, vibrating heat that seemed to originate from the very atoms of the room. Viktor was strapped into a reinforced steel frame in the center of the cube. His quilted jacket had been stripped away, leaving him in his thin undershirt and trousers. The heavy steel door, operated by a pneumatic hiss, sealed the world away. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, pressurized quiet that made the blood thrumming in Viktor's ears sound like the beat of a distant drum. High up in the corner, protected by a slab of quartz glass, was a camera lens. Beside it, a recessed speaker crackled to life. Do you feel it yet, Viktor? Rokotov's voice sounded different through the intercom, metallic, detached, like the voice of an indifferent god. We are starting at 30 degrees Celsius. A warm summer day in City Inn, the kind of day when people go for walks in the park. The kind of day when Lena, IRA, and Svetlana thought the world was safe. Viktor looked around wildly. He could see his own reflection in the polished ceramic tiles. He looked small, a pale insect caught in a jar of stone. Please, he screamed, his voice echoing flatly against the walls. I'll tell you everything. I'll give you the locations. I'll sign any confession. Just let me out. A confession is a legal document. Viktor, the voice replied. It requires a court, a prosecutor, and a defense. We have moved past those formalities. You told me earlier that you were a model worker. Today, we are going to see how well you work under pressure. We are increasing the temperature to 40 degrees. The hum of the induction coils shifted in frequency, a low, visceral vibration that Viktor felt in his teeth. Within minutes, the air began to thicken. The moisture on his skin turned into a slick, oily sweat. 40 degrees was not yet painful, but it was suffocating. It was the heat of a fever, the heat of a stifling, windowless room. Behind the quartz glass in the observation booth, Rokotov stood with his arms crossed. He watched the monitor, where Viktor's chest was heaving in shallow, panicked bursts. Beside the general, the specialist adjusted a series of sliders on a console. His heart rate is 110, the specialist noted. Body temperature is beginning to climb. Shall I hold the plateau? No, Rokotov said, his eyes fixed on the screen. He spent years watching life fade slowly. He enjoyed the gradual transition from warmth to cold. We are going to offer him the opposite. Raise it to 50. 50 degrees Celsius. The threshold of the unbearable. Inside the chamber, Viktor felt the first real bite of the furnace. Every breath he took felt like inhaling fine, hot sand. His undershirt was now a sodden rag clinging to his ribs. He tried to shift his weight, but the steel frame was already beginning to absorb the heat, the metal feeling like a brand against his wrists. 50 degrees, Viktor, the intercom crackled. This is the temperature of the Karakum Desert. This is the heat that breaks the will of soldiers. But you aren't a soldier. You are a shadow. Tell me about the knife, Viktor. Tell me why you left those marks on Alina's throat. Viktor's mind was beginning to fray. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on his skull, making his thoughts move like sludge. It was the power, he gasped, his tongue feeling like a piece of dry leather. I wanted them to see me. I was just a driver, a ghost in a truck. But when I had the knife, I was the king. I was the one. Who decided? You were a king of the trash heaps, Rokotov's voice rasped. You chose victims who couldn't fight back. You were a coward who found a way to feel brave in the dark. But there is no darkness here, Viktor. Only the light of the truth. 60 degrees. The shift was immediate. 60 degrees is the point where human protein begins to lose its structure if exposed for too long. Viktor's skin turned a bright, angry red. He began to howl, a high, thin sound that didn't sound human. He pulled against the zip ties, the plastic melting into his flesh, but the steel frame held him fast. He looked at the camera lens, his eyes bulging, bloodshot with burst capillaries. Through the haze of the shimmering air, he saw, or thought he saw, the face of Elena. She wasn't screaming. She was just watching him, her eyes filled with the same cold indifference he had once shown her. I'm sorry. He shrieked, a primal, animalistic sound. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Apologies are for mistakes, Viktor, Rokotov said. But what you did was a choice. You chose to be a beast. And now, the state is going to treat you like one. We are going to see how sweet the heat feels at 70 degrees. 70 degrees. The temperature of pasteurization. The temperature that kills bacteria. In the cold, calculating mind of General Rokotov, this was no longer an interrogation. It was a disinfection. He was scouring the earth of a virus that had lived in the shadows of the Soviet dream for too long. In the observation booth, the specialist's hand hovered over the emergency shutoff, his face pale. He looked at the general. Rokotov's face was illuminated by the glow of the monitors, a face of iron, a face that had finally found its target. He's losing consciousness, sir, the specialist whispered. Wake him up, Rokotov commanded. He hasn't even begun to pay the interest on his debt. Part 8. The denaturation of a soul and the scream of the void. The observation booth was silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of the cooling fans in the control console. General Rokotov stood as motionless as a statue carved from Siberian granite. He watched the screen, where the shimmering heat waves made Viktor's body appear to be melting, a distorted reflection in a house of horrors. To the specialists and analysts in the room, it was a test of endurance. To Rokotov, It was a ritual of purging. He's drifting, the specialist said, his voice a mere thread of sound. Vasodilation is at its limit. His brain is shutting down to protect itself from the thermal shock. Revive him, Rokotov commanded. His voice was cold, devoid of the slightest tremor of human hesitation. I want him to be present for every second of the countdown. He didn't allow his victims the mercy of unconsciousness. Neither shall we. The specialist turned a dial. A surge of pressurized, oxygen-enriched cold air blasted through the vents into the chamber, hitting Viktor like a physical blow. Simultaneously, a series of automated needles, recessed within the steel frame of the chair, hissed. They injected a potent cocktail of adrenaline and neurostimulants directly into Viktor's femoral artery. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Viktor's body jolted, his back arching so sharply that the sound of a vertebra popping echoed through the intercom. His eyes snapped open, two red, weeping pits of agony. The stimulus forced his nervous system into a state of hyper-awareness, amplifying every sensation 1,000-fold. He wasn't just feeling the heat anymore, he was experiencing the very molecules of his body vibrating into a state of chaos. Listen to me, Viktor, Rokotov's voice boomed through the chamber, sounding like the voice of a judge at the gates of Gehenna. We are at 80 degrees Celsius. This is the temperature at which proteins begin to coagulate. Your blood is thickening in your veins. Your lungs are blistering with every breath. You have precisely 3 minutes before your brain begins to cook. Use them. Tell me about the others. Tell me where you put the girl from the music school. Tell me where the student from the Textiles Institute is. Viktor's head lolled. He looked at the camera, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a hot pier. His lips were black, cracked, and weeping a clear, yellowish fluid. The old construction site, he wheezed, the words tearing at his throat. Under the concrete slabs. Sector 4. I like the way they fit there. They stayed cold. Even in the summer. Rokotov signaled to an aide, who immediately began barking orders into a secure telephone line. Within minutes, GRU recovery teams would be at the site, digging up the evidence that Captain Sorokin had spent years ignoring. But for the general, the evidence was secondary. He was hunting for the why. You did it because you were invisible, didn't you, Viktor? Rokotov asked, his voice almost gentle now, a predator purring over a broken kill. You were the bread truck driver, the man who brought life to the city every morning. No one ever looked at you. You were a piece of the furniture. And you hated them for it, didn't you? You hated them for being happy, for having lives that mattered while you were just a ghost behind a steering wheel. Viktor let out a jagged, rattling laugh that turned into a coughing fit, spraying a mist of blood against the ceramic tiles. I wasn't a ghost. When I had them, they were the ones who didn't exist. I was the only thing in the world. I was the sun. The sun? Rokotov's eyes narrowed. Then let us see if you can survive your own element. 90 degrees. The shift was a roar of white-hot sound. The air in the chamber became a shimmering, visible wall of kinetic energy. The ceramic tiles began to glow with a faint, dull orange hue. Viktor's undershirt burst into scorched rags. His skin began to peel away in long, translucent strips, revealing the raw, red meat beneath. He was no longer a man. He was a biological ruin, a testament to the absolute fragility of the human form when pitted against the indifferent power of physics. Please, Viktor whimpered, his voice now a mere hiss. Kill me. Just shoot me. Use the pistol. The pistol is for soldiers, Rokotov said. It is for men who have honor to lose. You, Viktor, are a defect in the machinery. And defects are not executed. They are liquidated. They are erased. In his delirium, in the final, agonizing sparks of his dying brain, Viktor felt a surge of defiant, animalistic malice. He looked at the camera lens, focusing his last ounce of will on the silhouette of the man behind the glass. She was beautiful, General, Viktor hissed, his eyes wide and vacant. You're Elena. She tasted like lavender and fear. I made her scream your name. But you weren't there. You were nowhere. I was the last thing she saw. The silence in the observation booth was so profound it felt as though the very air had been vacuumed out of the room. The specialist froze, his hand hovering over the controls. Major Volkov looked at the general, expecting an explosion of rage. But Rokotov did not move. He did not scream. He did not even flinch. His face was a mask of cold, absolute vacuum. 100 degrees, Rokotov said. His voice was no longer human. It was the sound of a steel door slamming shut forever. Maximum intensity. Burn the virus out. The specialist hesitated for a fraction of a second, his conscience screaming against the horror he was being asked to facilitate. Sir, at 100, the moisture in his tissues will. I know what will happen, Rokotov said. Execute the order. Now. The specialist turned the lever to the red zone. Inside the concrete furnace, the laws of biology were officially suspended, replaced by the laws of a blast furnace. The induction coils screamed with a high-pitched, electronic wail. The air itself began to ionize, the chamber filling with a pale, ghostly blue light. Viktor Sleptsov, the god of the gray city, didn't have time to scream. His blood, heated to the boiling point within his own veins, expanded with a localized, explosive force. His eyes, the windows through which he had watched so many die, simply burst. He was a silhouette of black ash against a wall of white-hot light. Rokotov watched until the monitor showed nothing but a shimmering, empty void of thermal static. He stood there for a long time, the glow of the screen reflected in his eyes. He had found the beast. He had destroyed the monster. He had restored a horrific, bloody kind of balance to the universe. But as he turned away from the screen, leaving the concrete furnace to its final, cooling clicks, Pavel Rokotov realized a truth more terrifying than any interrogation. The beast was dead, but the hunter was gone. In the darkness of Object 12, there were no victors. There was only the ash, the silence, and the cold, gray eternity of the Soviet night. Part 9. The ashes of justice and the cold embrace of the state. The roar of the induction coils at Object 12 did not end with a bang, but with a long, mournful whine as the power was slowly bled from the system. In the subterranean silence of Level 3, the red warning lights flickered out, replaced by the steady, indifferent green of the safe-to-enter signal. The pneumatic hiss of the chamber's seal opening sounded like the final, weary sigh of a dying god. A thick, swirling mist of steam and ionized ozone billowed out of the doorway, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet scent that no one in the room would ever be able to forget. It was the smell of organic matter reduced to its chemical foundations. The specialists, their faces hidden behind heavy industrial respirators, stepped into the chamber with the tentative grace of men walking on the surface of the moon. Where Viktor Sleptsov, the model worker and bread truck god, had once been strapped, there was now only a blackened, skeletal husk, fused to the warped steel of the testing frame. The intense, molecular vibration of the heat had done more than just kill him, it had effectively erased his humanity. He was no longer a person, he was a biological waste product, a scorched shadow in a room built for spacecraft. General Pavel Rokotov stood in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the cleanup crew. He did not look at the remains of the beast. He looked at the ceramic tiles of the floor. He had spent his entire life in the service of a state that believed in the absolute power of the collective, but in this moment, he felt the crushing weight of a singular, private void. He had achieved what the Soviet legal system could not: absolute, symmetrical retribution. But as he stood in the cooling air of the bunker, he realized that the concrete furnace had not only consumed Viktor. It had consumed the man Pavel Rokotov used to be. Dispose of the biomatter, Rokotov said, his voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. According to the Protocol for Class 4 hazardous waste, I want no record of this individual ever entering this facility. I want no grave. I want nothing but the ash and the silence. Yes, Comrade General, Major Volkov replied, his eyes averted. He, too, felt the shift in the atmosphere. The war was over, but the victory felt like a defeat. While the disinfection of Object 12 was being completed, the GRU recovery teams were busy at the old construction site in Sector 4. In the gray, pre-dawn light, under the watchful eyes of silent men in trench coats, the heavy concrete slabs were lifted by military cranes. Beneath them, they found the truth that Captain Sorokin had spent years burying. They found Lena. They found Ira. They found Svetlana. 6 women, preserved by the cold, damp earth and the indifference of the militia, were finally brought back into the world. For the families in City Inn, the news came not through a televised report, but through a series of quiet, late-night visits from representatives of the Ministry of Defense. They were told that the culprit had been identified as a transient with no fixed address, who had been killed while resisting arrest. It was a lie, a neat, convenient lie that allowed the local militia to keep their bonuses and the regional MVD to keep their pride. The state, even in its most righteous moments, preferred the lie. The Soviet Union could not admit that it had bred a monster, nor could it admit that one of its finest generals had turned into a vigilante. But the system was not as blind as Sorokin had hoped. The ripples from the Object 12 incident eventually reached the heavy, oak-paneled offices of the Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB in Moscow. The KGB did not care about the death of a bread truck driver. They cared about the fact that a GRU general had operated outside the nomenclature of power. They cared about the fact that Rokotov had used a state-of-the-art military facility for a personal vendetta. In the eyes of the Central Committee, Rokotov had become a variable. And variables were dangerous in a world built on the rigid, gray geometry of the stagnation. 3 days after the liquidation of Viktor, a black Volga sedan, unmarked and silent, pulled up to the gates of the Pine Grove Sanatorium. 2 men in identical gray overcoats stepped out. They did not ask for permission, they presented a warrant signed by the highest levels of the party. Pavel Rokotov was found in his office, staring at a photograph of Elena. He was still wearing his civilian clothes, his medals sitting in an open velvet box on the desk. He looked at the men from the Lubyanka and gave a small, weary nod. He had been expecting them. General Rokotov, the senior officer said, his voice as dry as a desert wind. You are required in Moscow for a consultation regarding the misuse of state resources at Object 12. Your command of the regional security apparatus is hereby suspended. Rokotov stood up. He felt a strange, light-headed sense of relief. He had completed his mission. He had found the wolf and burned it from the earth. The consequences were merely the taxes he had to pay for his peace. I am ready, Rokotov said. As he was led away toward the waiting car, the city of N was already beginning to forget. The bread trucks were back on their routes, delivering batons of white bread to the hungry citizens. The streetlights in there were still burning through every other bulb. The militia, under a new and equally cynical commander, were already worrying about their quotas for the next quarter. The monster was gone, but the darkness that had birthed him remained, deeper and colder than before. Pavel Rokotov looked out the window of the Volga as it sped toward the capital, watching the gray, endless forests fly by. He had used the concrete furnace to destroy a beast, but he knew that in the shadows of the Soviet night, there were always more hunters, and the state was the hungriest of them all. Part 10. The nomenclatura of silence and the ghost in the archives. The journey from the provincial shadows of city into the cold, monolithic heart of Moscow was a transition between 2 different types of darkness. For Pavel Rokotov, sitting in the back of the unmarked Volga, the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the asphalt sounded like a funeral march for a world that had already ended. He watched the silhouettes of the birch trees flash by in the moonlight, pale, skeletal fingers reaching out of the Russian night. He knew that he was being moved from the theater of war to the theater of bureaucracy, where the weapons were not machine guns or induction heaters, but fountain pens, rubber stamps, and the absolute power of the line. The Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB, was a building that breathed with the collective history of Soviet terror. Its corridors were hushed, lined with heavy red carpets that swallowed the sound of footsteps, and its air was permeated with the smell of old paper and the ozone of high-voltage electronics. Here, Rokotov was no longer a general lieutenant of the GRU. He was Subject 44 Alpha, a variable that needed to be balanced within the equation of the state. He was not taken to a dungeon. Instead, he was led to a spacious, wood-paneled office on the 4th floor, a room of golden nomenclatura luxury. There was a portrait of Felix Dzerzhinsky on the wall, a heavy green-shaded lamp on the desk, and a window that looked out over the gray, indifferent sprawl of Dzerzhinsky Square. Waiting for him was a man whose name was never spoken aloud, a first deputy chairman of the KGB, a man whose power was measured not in medals, but in the number of lives he could erase with a single phone call. "Sit down, Pavel," the official said, his voice as smooth and lethal as a silk garrote. He didn't look up from a folder on his desk, the folder containing the after-action report of Object 12. "We have spent 3 days reviewing the logs, the energy expenditure, the unauthorized use of a high-security facility, the biological disposal. It is a remarkable piece of work. Efficient, thorough, terrifying." Rokotov sat, his back as straight as a bayonet. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not beg for mercy. "The beast is dead," he said, his voice flat. "The victims have been recovered. The city is safe. If you have come to discuss socialist legality, save your breath. The law did not exist in City Inn until I brought it there." The official looked up, his eyes 2 chips of gray ice. "The law, Pavel, is a monopoly held by the state. You did not bring the law, you brought a personal vendetta. You turned a state laboratory into a private execution chamber. If we allow a general to become a judge and a jury today, who will the colonels decide to burn tomorrow? You have broken the most sacred rule of our order. You have proven that an individual can be more powerful than the system." "The system was protecting a monster," Rokotov countered. "Your stick system and your quarterly bonuses gave a murderer the license to hunt. I did what the party was too cowardly to do. I looked at the darkness and I burned it out." The official sighed, a sound of profound, weary disappointment. "You are a hero of the Soviet Union, Pavel. You have served in Afghanistan, in Africa, in the shadows of 5 continents. We cannot put you on trial. A public trial would reveal that a serial killer existed in our workers' paradise, and that a general had to resort to torture to stop him. It would shatter the myth of our stability." The official leaned forward, the green lamp casting long, distorted shadows across his face. "Therefore, you do not exist. General Rokotov died 3 days ago in City Inn of a sudden heart attack brought on by the stress of his wife's tragic death. You will be buried with full military honors. A closed casket, of course." "And what of me?" Rokotov asked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You will be taken to a sanatorium of special purpose in the closed city of Severodvinsk. You will have books, you will have food, and you will have a view of the lake. But you will never speak to another human being again. You will be a ghost in a gilded cage until the nature you have so violently challenged finally takes you." And so, the state achieved its final victory. The concrete furnace was sealed. The witnesses at Object 12 were reassigned to the furthest reaches of the Kamchatka Peninsula. The records were moved to the special archive, accessible only to those with the highest security clearance. The city of N returned to its gray, stagnant peace. Captain Sorokin was quietly retired. Viktor Sleptsov was listed as a missing person whose file was eventually lost in a warehouse fire. Pavel Rokotov lived for another 7 years in the silence of the north. He spent his days watching the ice form on Lake Baikal, his mind a gallery of faces he had seen through the smoke of 100 wars. He never spoke of Elena. He never spoke of the bread truck driver. He became a man of stone, waiting for the furnace of his own heart to finally cool. He died in 1988, just as the Soviet Union began to groan and fracture under its own weight. It wasn't until the mid-1990s, during the chaotic archive revolution following the collapse of the USSR, that a young researcher named Kirill Volkov, the son of the major who had served Rokotov, found a hidden diary in a false bottom of a GRU footlocker. It was a handwritten account of the events at City Inn. In the final entry, dated October 20th, 1983, Rokotov had written, "They say that the law is a scale, but they are wrong. The law is a furnace. It must be hot enough to consume the beast, or it is merely a pile of cold iron. I have burned my soul to ash to protect a city that didn't want to be protected. I do not ask for forgiveness. I only ask that the next time the darkness comes, you do not wait for a general. Because by then, the only thing left will be the heat." The story of the concrete furnace remains a forbidden legend in the hallways of the modern FSB and the GRU. A cautionary tale of what happens when the shadow becomes too bright for the state to control. It is a story of a time when the stick system met the general's vendetta, and when the only true justice was found at the center of a concrete cube, where the temperature rose until the evil simply evaporated. General Rokotov's grave remains unmarked, somewhere in the frozen earth of the north. But in the city of N, on certain cold, misty autumn nights, people still whisper about the bread truck that vanished and the general who brought the sun into a cellar. Because in the end, justice in the Soviet night was never about the truth. It was about the fire.